What if the worst is still yet to come? We have spent years, going through what Jeffrey Epstein did. The islands, the mansions, the trafficking, the powerful men who looked the other way. And every time we think we have hit the bottom of this story, the floor drops again. This week, it dropped again. Hidden inside the millions of pages of Epstein documents that the Department of Justice quietly released to the public, there is an email. A single email that is now driving an official state investigation, a bipartisan legislative inquiry with subpoena power, and a question that nobody, not federal investigators, not state prosecutors, not the FBI, has ever actually answered. Are there bodies buried at Jeffrey Epstein's New Mexico ranch? I know how that sounds. I know. But stay with me. Because this is not a conspiracy theory. This is an active, funded, official investigation. And the reason it exists is not because of a tip from a political enemy or a rumor that went viral. It is because the evidence of what happened at that ranch, and the evidence of how completely it was ignored by the people whose job it was to investigate, has been sitting in sealed federal files for years. And now those files are open. So today, we are going to go through all of it. The email, the ranch, the history of allegations that go back almost 30 years, the documented, confirmed failure of federal investigators to ever search this property, the state officials who are now demanding answers, and the forensic science. What would it actually take to find out if these allegations are true? And what could investigators realistically expect to find after all this time? This is one of those stories where the more you dig, the darker it gets. Let's dig. Before we get to the email, we need to understand the property at the center of this. Because Zorro Ranch is not just a name that comes up in the Epstein story. It is one of the main chapters of it. Jeffrey Epstein purchased Zorro Ranch in 1993. The seller was Bruce King, a 3-time Democratic governor of New Mexico. The price was reportedly around $12 million. What Epstein built on that land over the following years was extraordinary in scale and, as we now understand, in purpose. The property covered 7,500 acres of high desert terrain about 30 miles south of Santa Fe. That is not a ranch house with some land around it. That is a self-contained world. Epstein constructed a 26,700 square foot mansion on a hilltop. To put that in perspective, the average American home is around 2,000 square feet. Epstein's hilltop mansion was 13 times that size, and the mansion was just the beginning. The property also had its own private runway, a hangar, a helipad, a firehouse, a 7-bay heated garage, guest quarters, the full infrastructure of a man who intended to operate completely outside the view of the outside world. He ran the ranch through a shell company, first called Zorro Trust, then renamed Cypress, Inc. Embedded within the property's total acreage were approximately 1,200 acres that Epstein did not even own outright. He leased them from the New Mexico State Land Office. That is public land. So taxpayer land, rented to one of the most prolific sex offenders in American history, while state officials apparently asked few questions about what was happening on it. Locally, people had a name for it. They called it the Playboy Ranch. That was not meant as a compliment. It was a signal. The kind of name a community gives a place when they know something is wrong but cannot prove it. When they have heard things. When guests arrive by private jet and leave without any visible accountability for what happens between arrival and departure. And the documented allegations tied to this property go back a very long time. Court filings show Epstein is accused of sexually abusing a 16-year-old girl at Zorro Ranch as far back as 1996. That is not a recent allegation. And that is a nearly 30-year-old allegation that was never properly adjudicated. Multiple civil lawsuits named the ranch as a site of abuse. Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most documented and credible accusers, testified in a 2016 deposition that Ghislaine Maxwell directed her to give former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson a massage at the property. The ranch also had resident managers, a New Zealand couple named Karen and Bryce Gordon. According to local reporting, the Gordons hosted regular parties at the property, including events that brought in women from the local area. After Epstein's legal troubles escalated, the Gordons reportedly went into hiding. Not retired, not moved away, into hiding. Ranch managers who felt their personal safety was at risk. That is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. When researchers began going through the released Epstein files, the ranch came up over 4,000 times. Email signatures reading Zorro Management LLC. Photographs of women and girls with their faces redacted. A 2015 itinerary showing Epstein at the ranch on successive days before flying to San Francisco. Correspondence stretching from 2012 to 2018. The ranch was not a footnote, it was a hub. And here is the fact that makes all of this matter even more than it already does. In a December 2019 email, now part of the public record because it was in the released files, federal investigators confirmed that as of that date, they had not searched the New Mexico property. That email was written 4 months after Epstein died in federal custody. 4 months after the man who could have answered every question about what happened at that ranch was gone. And federal agents had still not walked through the gate. We are going to come back to why that happened and who made that decision, because the answer is important. Now let's talk about the specific allegation that has triggered everything happening in New Mexico right now. In November 2019, 3 months after Epstein's death, someone sent an email to a local New Mexico radio host named Edward Aragon. The sender was anonymous. Aragon later confirmed he had no idea who sent it. He received it out of nowhere. And the email opened with this. It described the sender as a former member of staff at what it called the Zorro, a reference to Zorro Ranch, and stated that it was sending sensitive material as personal insurance that the sender had held in case of future litigation against Epstein. Then came the core allegation. The email stated that somewhere in the hills outside the ranch, 2 foreign girls had been buried, on the orders of Epstein and someone referred to as Madam G, widely understood to be a reference to Ghislaine Maxwell. The email claimed both girls died by strangulation during what it described as rough fetish sex. The email also referenced links to what it described as video recordings taken from Epstein's property, including one it labeled as a sex video involving a minor. And then the sender made a demand. Need 1 Bitcoin, worth approximately $8,000 at the time, transferred to a specified wallet address by 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time that same day. In exchange, a USB drive would be shipped anonymously containing what the sender called exclusive, never-before-shared material. No attorneys, no samples, no questions. Confirm and pay, or don't. Edward Aragon did not pay. Instead, he forwarded the email directly to the FBI. That is the reason this document ended up in the federal files to begin with, and the reason it became part of the public release that the Department of Justice was required to carry out under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, passed by Congress in 2025. Aragon has said he spoke with an FBI agent after submitting the email. He never heard back. He did not know what the agency did with it, or whether anyone followed up on the claims. Now, let me be direct about something, because I think it is important to be honest with you about what this document actually is and is not. This email has every structural hallmark of an extortion attempt. The anonymity, the urgent same-day deadline, the cryptocurrency demand, the refusal to provide any sample evidence, the promise of exclusivity. These are not the characteristics of a whistleblower coming forward in good faith. They are the characteristics of someone trying to extract money by weaponizing the uncertainty that surrounds a dead man's crimes. New Mexico's own law enforcement officials have been candid about this, and the state's Chief Deputy Attorney General James Grayson acknowledged publicly that the allegations appear unsubstantiated and stem from an anonymous source referencing events that purportedly occurred more than 6 years ago. The department flagged significant concerns about the reliability, authenticity, and credibility of the claims. So why are we taking this seriously? Why is the state of New Mexico launching a $2.5 million investigation? Why is the Attorney General reopening a criminal probe? Because of the context. Because of what we know about that ranch. Because of what we know about the complete failure of federal investigators to ever search it. Because the Epstein case, more than almost any case in recent history, has demonstrated that the allegations that seem too dark, too extreme, and too conspiratorial to be true have a troubling habit of turning out to be true. Not every dark claim about Jeffrey Epstein was a lie. Not even most of them. And because of that history, New Mexico has decided that the only responsible position is to find out. Not to assume it is false. Not to assume it is true. To actually investigate. Here is the part of this story that I find genuinely difficult to explain away as incompetence. Because what happened? Or more precisely, what did not happen? At Zorro Ranch after Epstein's arrest and death follows a pattern that goes beyond oversight. In October 2019, just 2 months after Epstein's death, the then Attorney General of New Mexico, Hector Balderas, wrote directly to the U.S. Attorney for New Mexico, John Anderson, requesting a joint investigation. Balderas specifically asked federal authorities to consider seizing Epstein's New Mexico landholdings. His letter stated that the state had been actively investigating criminality connected to Epstein in New Mexico and had been assisting other state and federal agencies. The response from the federal side, specifically from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, which was overseeing the Epstein prosecution, was effectively, stand down. They did not want a parallel state investigation running alongside the federal one. And according to the documentation that later emerged, New Mexico agreed. The state AG's office ceased its sex trafficking investigation and passed along whatever it had gathered to the federal authorities in New York. And then those federal authorities did not search the ranch. There is a December 2019 email in the released files, sent from federal prosecutors to the executors of Epstein's estate, that flatly states federal agents had not searched the New Mexico property. This was 4 months after Epstein died. The ranch was sitting there, uninvestigated. And the federal government that had told New Mexico to back off had not sent anyone to look at it. The ranch then sat for years. Epstein's estate retained ownership. And in 2023, it was sold at public auction. The buyer was an LLC that had been created just 1 month before the purchase. Connected to the family of Donald Huffines, a Texas businessman currently running for state comptroller. The property was renamed San Rafael Ranch. A spokesperson for the Huffines family has confirmed they had never visited the property before purchasing it, that they bought it fairly at auction with proceeds benefiting Epstein's victims, and that they will cooperate fully with any law enforcement request to access the property. To date, no such request has apparently been made. New Mexico Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard has been among the loudest official voices calling attention to this failure. Garcia Richard's office oversees the state land that Epstein leased through his Cypress Shell company. Back in 2019, she canceled those leases after her office was literally denied access to inspect state land that Epstein controlled. Denied access to inspect land the state of New Mexico owned. She subsequently sent hundreds of pages of Zorro Ranch leasing records to the state attorney general, and then watched as years passed without a single member of law enforcement, to her knowledge, ever investigating the ranch or the adjacent state land. Garcia Richard wrote in her letter calling for investigation. It is our responsibility to manage this land, and if it was being used for nefarious purposes, if it was being used for criminal purposes, we need to know. 7 years after she first canceled those leases. 7 years. U.S. Representative Melanie Stansbury reviewed the Zorro Ranch files and went on record describing what she found as, in her words, dark, dark stuff. She stated plainly that the FBI never conducted a full forensic investigation of the ranch property, that crimes were clearly committed there, that victims went to law enforcement and were not followed up on, and that the ranch was sold before any thorough investigation could be completed. And the question of who benefited from this inaction is one that a fully resourced investigation may finally be able to answer. Whatever one thinks of the specific burial allegation, whether it is credible, whether it is an extortion hoax, or whether the truth lies somewhere complicated in between, what is happening in New Mexico right now is significant and real. The state legislature voted unanimously. That means every Republican and every Democrat in the chamber, to establish a formal investigative body called the Truth Commission. 4 lawmakers sit on it. Representatives Andrea Romero and Mariana Anaya, both Democrats, and Representatives Andrea Reeb and William Hall II, both Republicans. Bipartisan, unanimous. That is worth noting, because very little in American politics right now is bipartisan or unanimous. This commission has subpoena power. It can compel testimony. It will hear from survivors of alleged abuse at the ranch, from local residents, from anyone with knowledge of what went on at that property. It has a budget of $2.5 million, funded through a prior settlement the AG's office reached with financial services companies for failing to address Epstein's alleged abuses. Preliminary findings are due in July of this year. A final report by the end of 2026. The Commission's stated goals go beyond the burial allegations specifically. Lawmakers want to understand why Epstein was never required to register as a sex offender in New Mexico, even after his 2008 Florida conviction. They want to know whether state officials were aware of what was happening at the ranch and chose not to act. They want to identify guests at the property, and they want to understand the failures of oversight that allowed Epstein to operate in the state, so that those failures can be codified into reformed law. Representative Andrea Romero, who co-sponsored the legislation and chairs the commission, framed it this way. New Mexicans deserve to know the truth about what went on at Zorro Ranch and who knew about it. Federal investigators failed to produce an official record. This commission is how the gaps get filled. But the Truth Commission is only part of the current response. On February 20th of this year, New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres formally announced the reopening of the state's criminal investigation into Zorro Ranch. This is a criminal probe, not a legislative inquiry, not a policy review. A criminal investigation, and with special agents and prosecutors assigned, moving quickly to obtain the complete unredacted federal case file. The state closed its previous investigation in 2019 at the request of federal prosecutors. It is now opening it again. Because, in the department's own words, revelations outlined in the previously sealed FBI files warrant further examination. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham weighed in at a press conference in terms that left no ambiguity about the state's position. Her statement, "We do not care who you are. If you did something and you are associated with these Epstein cases and you perpetrated a crime and there are still victims, there are potentially deaths and bodies, we will find it." Like the property's current owner, the Huffines family has confirmed through their spokesperson that they have never been approached by local, state, or federal law enforcement requesting access to the ranch. If that request comes, they say, they will cooperate fully. That request has not yet come. Let's set aside for a moment the question of whether the burial allegation is true. And let's ask a different question. One that is entirely scientific and has nothing to do with politics or credibility or legal proceedings. If there are human remains buried somewhere on or near a property like Zorro Ranch, what would it actually take to find them? And if found, what could forensic science realistically tell investigators after all this time? These are questions with real answers. And those answers come from the field of forensic science. Specifically from the work of forensic pathologists and forensic anthropologists who deal with exactly these kinds of situations. Richland County Coroner Dr. Nate Rutherford has addressed precisely these questions in public commentary on the Zorro Ranch allegations, and what he describes is a picture of genuine difficulty, not impossibility, but difficulty that demands the right tools, the right expertise, and significant time. The first challenge is the terrain. New Mexico's high desert is not the soft, loamy soil of a crime scene you might picture from a television drama. It is hard-packed, dry, rocky ground. Excavation in that environment requires specialized equipment and, crucially, some idea of where to look. A property covering 7,500 acres cannot be searched the way you would search a backyard. The standard approach in this kind of situation is ground-penetrating radar. Devices that scan below the surface and detect anomalies. Disturbances in the soil, objects that should not be there, patterns consistent with a gravesite. But even that technology requires a starting point. Without a credible lead on location, investigators would be running radar equipment across terrain the size of a small city. Dr. Rutherford has noted that a targeted search of a known area might take hours. A grid search of the full property could take weeks or months with multiple devices deployed simultaneously. Then there is the question of what would remain. These alleged deaths, if they occurred at all, are not recent. The anonymous email does not specify when. If we are talking about events from the mid to late 1990s or the 2000s, the period when Epstein's activity at the ranch was most extensively documented, we are talking about remains that have been in the ground for potentially 2 or 3 decades. At that point, soft tissue is gone. The body has decomposed back into the earth. What an excavation would produce, if anything, is skeletal remains. This creates a significant forensic problem when the alleged cause of death is strangulation. In a fresh body autopsy, strangulation is identified through soft tissue findings. Petechial hemorrhaging, those tiny burst blood vessels in the eyes and face, bleeding within the strap muscles of the neck, and damage to the throat structures. None of those signs survive in skeletal remains. And the one skeletal indicator that pathologists look for in strangulation cases is a fracture of the hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the throat that is often broken during manual strangulation. Dr. Rutherford has pointed out that while the hyoid can survive burial, it is among the most fragile bones in the human body. Whether it would still be intact and interpretable after decades in New Mexico desert soil is genuinely uncertain. The conclusion from a forensic perspective is this: if remains were found, proving strangulation as the cause of death would be difficult, possibly impossible, depending on the preservation state of the skeleton. Identification presents a parallel set of challenges. The anonymous email described the alleged victims as foreign nationals. If that is accurate, their names are unlikely to appear in any U.S. missing persons database. Their families may have no record of a missing persons report being filed in this country. In that situation, DNA becomes the primary identification tool. And the best source of DNA from old skeletal remains is the femur bone, which, due to its density, preserves genetic material better than other bones. Forensic anthropologists can extract DNA by cutting a small sample from the femur, but that DNA is only useful if there is something to compare it against. A family member's sample, a foreign database, some existing record that connects to a potential identity. Bone measurements, femur length, skull circumference, overall skeletal proportions, can provide estimated age at death, which the Commission would need in a case involving alleged minors. But establishing exact identity from skeletal remains without a known candidate is a long, painstaking process, requiring international cooperation and potentially years of work. There is, however, an area of genuine forensic potential. Hair. Hair is extraordinarily durable. Archaeological excavations have recovered hair samples thousands of years old. Hair retains DNA, and it also retains transferred DNA, meaning the hair of a perpetrator who came in close physical contact with a victim can potentially be found among the victim's remains or associated materials. Hair also retains traces of drugs, chemicals, and nutritional markers that can provide context about a person's life and circumstances before death. Items buried with a body. Clothing, personal effects, on any materials in the immediate burial area can also preserve evidence in ways that are not immediately obvious. Fiber transfers, chemical residues, trace materials that a person with resources but without forensic experience might not think to remove. Dr. Rutherford has noted that most people who commit acts like this are not professional criminals. They make mistakes. The evidence of those mistakes can persist in the soil long after the body itself has deteriorated. Any excavation that did take place, if it came to that, would need to be conducted by forensic anthropologists working methodically, layer by layer, preserving everything in the immediate burial environment, not just the bones. It would be a long, careful, expensive process, the kind of process that does not make for quick news cycles, the kind that requires a sustained institutional commitment to following the evidence wherever it leads. Which brings us back to the central question: has anyone ever been willing to make that commitment about Zorro Ranch? The answer so far has been no. I want to zoom out for a moment, because while the burial allegation is the most dramatic element of what we are covering today, there is a larger story here. One that is in some ways even more disturbing because it is better documented and harder to deny. The story of Zorro Ranch is, at its core, a story about what happens when accountability systems fail in sequence. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, over decades, in ways that consistently serve to protect a wealthy and well-connected man at the expense of his victims. Consider the timeline. Epstein allegedly began abusing victims at this ranch in 1996. For the next decade, he continued to operate, entertaining powerful guests, flying in on private jets, living behind the walls of a compound that no law enforcement agency felt motivated to examine too closely. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida to state charges of soliciting a minor, a deal so favorable to him that the prosecutor who negotiated it later became a cabinet secretary and had to resign in the resulting scandal. But even after that conviction, Epstein was not required to register as a sex offender in New Mexico. The state that hosted his largest and most private compound gave him a pass. After his 2019 arrest on federal sex trafficking charges, the New Mexico Attorney General opened an investigation. The federal government asked them to stand down, and they complied. The federal government then did not search the ranch. Epstein died in custody, officially by suicide, though the circumstances of his death have never been fully satisfying to anyone who has looked at them closely. The ranch sat untouched. Then it was sold. Every one of those moments was a fork in the road. Everyone was a point where someone with authority could have said, "We are going to look at this property. We are going to find out what happened here. We are going to do our job." And at every single fork, the decision was made not to. Now, an anonymous extortion email, almost certainly not from someone acting in good faith, has somehow become the document that finally forces that reckoning. There is something deeply unsatisfying about that. The dozens of victims who went to law enforcement over the years, not who testified in civil proceedings, who gave names and dates and details, they were not enough. It took a Bitcoin demand to a local radio host to generate the political will for New Mexico to finally say, "We are going to investigate this properly." But here we are. And whatever the source of the current momentum, the investigation is real. The subpoena power is real. The criminal probe is real. The question now is whether the institutions that failed so completely for so long can be trusted to get it right this time. Let me bring this together. At the center of this story is a single anonymous email, unverified, almost certainly an extortion attempt, sent to a local radio host demanding $8,000 in Bitcoin in exchange for claims about murders at a Jeffrey Epstein property. That email, by itself, proves nothing. It is not evidence of anything except that someone in November 2019 tried to profit from the uncertainty surrounding a dead predator's crimes. But that email did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived against a backdrop of documented abuse at Zorro Ranch going back nearly 30 years. It arrived after federal investigators had explicitly confirmed they had not searched the property. It arrived after New Mexico's own investigation had been shut down at the request of those same federal investigators. It arrived after a ranch manager went into hiding out of fear for her safety. It arrived after photographs of women and girls, faces redacted, were found in the official files. It arrived after the ranch was referenced more than 4,000 times in documents that federal authorities had kept sealed for years. And now it has arrived, finally, into the hands of officials who are choosing to treat it as a starting point rather than a reason to look away. New Mexico has a truth commission with subpoena power and $2.5 million. New Mexico has a reopened criminal investigation. New Mexico has a governor who has said publicly that if there are bodies, they will find them. The current property owners have said they will cooperate with any search request. From a forensic science standpoint, finding answers, if answers exist, will be hard. The terrain is difficult. The time elapsed is significant. Strangulation leaves few traces in decades-old skeletal remains. Identifying foreign nationals from bones alone without a starting point could take years of international coordination. None of this is television forensics. None of it will be fast. But hard is not the same as impossible. And the question of whether two young women were killed on American soil, their deaths covered up, and their remains left in a desert that law enforcement spent years carefully not investigating. That is not a question we should be comfortable leaving unanswered. This story is moving. If you want to follow it as it develops, the Truth Commission findings, the criminal probe, whatever comes from finally turning the official gaze toward that ranch in the New Mexico desert, make sure you are subscribed. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because if this video has made one thing clear, it is that the public attention on this story is part of what is making the official attention happen. Some stories only get investigated when enough people refuse to let them be forgotten. This is one of them.